Yeah, no,
Thanks
okay.
again, Brian. It's great to meet you.
Well, we still have more greatness to come. And we're going to have the opportunity now to speak with and listen to Ms. Shirley Rivera. She's a chemical engineer applying strengths-based skills through the interplay of technical, social, cultural, and lived experiences, especially specializing in air quality, energy projects, and environmental communications. For over 30 years, she served in the federal government in consulting, an investor-owned utility, and a solopreneur on Calibrator. So with a whole lot of experience, she's been able to be diverse since 2020, technical writer, editor, EPRI, GT26, overhaul technical support manual, gas turbines inspections, assessments, commissioning, support of rebuttal testimony, and coal-fired power plants, control technologies. The list goes on and on and on. And we are welcome to meet Ms. Shirley Rivera, and she's going to talk to us about environmental justice when communities participate.
Yeah.
Welcome.
All right, how do I get this to, whoops, all right. And it's just this one?
Mhm.
All right,
Test it out and see.
yeah. So you all are my first presentation of this, and you think you're coming into, you guys are coming into my soapbox and my catharsis, so I really appreciate this, and I appreciate the intro. This is my contact information. I'm also in the app, so you can connect with me there, and I'll have this again at the end of the presentation. And you're here because you've obviously read the description. This is the quote that Regan gave to his staff. I was with EPA in 2000, up until 2014. So if you were here for the last presentation, the number for 2015 would have been 14,726 if I had not left. So, and it was voluntary incentive, not retirement age, but I'll just say of this few amount of people that did leave, we all got the max that they were offering, and I was not there long. So there was a 3-year person who was at EPA for 3 years, got $25,000 for the separation with taxes being taken out. Anyways, that's completely a tangent. And I'll be talking about federal, California, state and local. So I'll be talking a lot about my experience. And again, this was in the description, but I just wanted to boldface ideally what you'll be hearing, and give me feedback if part of this presentation does or does not meet what you want, or there's something else that you wish I would have talked about a little bit more. This is in 4 parts, but it's really 3. So the first part is kind of a little vignette of my own perspective about where environmental justice and community participation has been in the regulatory and compliance process. And then this second part is my catharsis. My catharsis is about experiences I've had, whether it's been called environmental justice directly or, in fact, environmental justice working with a nonprofit organization in San Diego. And then there's 3 that I was mentioning. And then the third one is a facility that just kind of got swept in with one of those nets that were thrown over in the Los Angeles County, South Coast Air Basin. And they just kind of got dragged into what ultimately is an environmental justice context. And then lastly, I'll be talking about public participation. So I am a charter member and advisory council member for what's called the P2 Club, the Public Participation Club, which is actually launching tomorrow. And it is a business-to-business club that we're hoping to have people come in and learn and share their best practices, and also help them understand a different way to start interacting with community and being part of the expectations that communities have for their business and industry neighbors. So I'm going to begin this meeting by saying, if you've ever been to a community meeting where there's been diverse population and there's a discussion about social justice issues or the like, often these community meetings begin with expectations and agreements. So part of this talk that I'm giving is also hopefully to inform you that when you are dealing with the public, consider now also a little bit about how you will be communicating with them, that you're talking with them and not at them, and set some ground rules. I'm an improviser, unscripted sketch. I'm not going to do any of that here. And I wanted, though, to bring in what is part of the improv experience, which really is the unexpected, unknown, And yet when people kind of see improv and they think it's great, like it's almost scripted and written, it's like, that can't be improvised. That's when you know that communication's going well. And some of what we do learn in dealing in this sort of unexpected landscape are things along the lines that I've listed here. And from a business perspective, you can think about when you meet with communities about where you are in the status and where they feel they're in the status structure, power and privilege. When people are explaining what they don't like, is it actually a tangible discomfort or is it emotional discomfort? You know, where does that land? This idea of shifting from fear to curiosity, I'll talk about that a little bit later. And then the idea of respecting personal boundaries and when in doubt, ask, both for yourself of your own company and also for the community that you're dealing with. I did not list the P2 Club expectations and agreements. I'll embed that in the third part of my talk. So just want to pause here. This is for me to get my breath a little bit and take a deep breath. So if anybody else wants to take a deep breath with me, I'm gonna do that now. All right, because my soapbox. I view the environmental justice landscape and have been since 1994. I can put my finger on it. As community, business, and government. And I think arguably there's academics. So scholars aside, not aside, scholars adjacent. There's a lot of studies that come from there, but I'm not going to put that here only because I want to talk about my own experience. In that, I was commissioned to do a report for Solar Turbines to talk about their new equipment that was coming out at the time. And they were getting grant funding from DOE. And I incorporated environmental justice and risk communication. Because back then in '94, there was already some rumbling, Solar Turbines is in California, about environmental justice, like how's this turbine going to impact me? Like, you know, I didn't think it would be a big deal, but it's actually been something that's followed me quite a bit. And it's around risk communication. So I will be talking about risk communication. You know, what is a piece of equipment doing? What's a facility doing? How is the community reacting to that? What is your business risk? What's the risk with the community? So I'll talk a little bit about that. In our work, we think of, we've got environmental justice sitting on top of, and for me, this is what I kind of think is the landscape, federal, state, local, and then there's the public. And I just want to put them there so you can see a little bit more about what I'm thinking about is that this foundation of federal, state, and local regs, legislation, this is really important for those of you who were at Matt's presentation. I think he did a really great job of explaining that. I'm a chemical engineer by education, not by being in a position of doing anything specifically at plant. But if I could make this move, this is like the Brownian motion of what happens in public participation and environmental justice. And it doesn't matter what the labels are, but to say that there is an interplay of community, government, and business. And when I'm looking at this intersection, how community interacts with business is different from the government. And so my talk is essentially, as environmental professionals or those who serve with them, is to think of yourself in the middle of this and how you're going to be communicating, or how have you communicated with the public regarding exposure, risks, and the like. So I'll revisit the term interplay a little bit more also. And if any of you are into architecture, there's a woman named Keller Easterling, and she actually talks about the interplay. And when you're talking about architecture, that space in between the buildings and the roads, like what are all those other interstitial spaces? This is my second pause button to take another breath. So I will be sharing with you my experiences directly regarding 3 specific projects. The first one is something when I was at EPA. The second one is currently now. And the third one is, I think, something that hopefully folks will be most interested in if you aren't in an environmental justice area or you're not sure how this could affect you. So when I was at EPA, I rejoined them in 2007. I had started out in college and I was straight in the PSD permit group in '87. And I went back in 2007 and I ended up on a project called the Avenal Power Center, Avenal Energy Project. In the end, so spoiler alert, the PSD permit ended up going to the 9th Circuit, which is unheard of. It's the first time anything like that had happened. And on top of that, the permit that we had written at the region was shipped over to headquarters, and they rewrote it. Let me say it differently. They wrote it differently. And I just want to say, this is just an image. The plant was in the Central Valley, San Joaquin Valley, in the PG&E territory, and it's a good plant. Natural gas fired solely, combined cycle, good gas turbine technology, dry cooling, met the issues associated with water-related concerns in the area, if you're familiar with the San Joaquin Valley. And a few things happened. So those two little paper things going on over there with lots of people, I'll explain. So it's predominantly farmland. If you ever are in California, you go from Northern California to Southern California, the other way, I-5 is the corridor. And Avenal was located in an area called Kings County. And both EPA and the applicant maybe should have known, I should have known, I don't know, that there are concerns about environmental justice. There is a hazardous waste landfill, waste management, and they had all of these issues. But we were up to proposing the permit, and then that's, I mean, we're pretty much at that completion timeframe. You got 6 months to punch out a permit. And we got hit. So two things happen. You go through the PSD permit program, you get your proposed permit, you put it out for public comment, you get the comments, maybe you have a hearing, maybe you don't, and then you write your final permit. We had two public hearings. The first one we had because procedurally, somebody had missed something, and it was as simple as not having a complete public notification mailing list. So, and how that was found out, I can talk about that a little bit later if somebody's interested. So we had to do a second one, which is fine. And those public meetings had to be bilingual, particularly for the demographics that it was in and the people that were interested. And more importantly, we had not talked to the nearby businesses that had experienced some concerns from the public. Now, I don't want to, it may not have had the name environmental justice, but the organizations that were concerned, there's an organization out of the Bay Area, which is miles away from Avenal, and Center for Biological Diversity, I think Earth Justice, a law firm that came out. And at the same time also, so this is around, what is it, 2009, 10, 11, NOx standards, SOx standards, greenhouse gases, all in flux. And the local agency had some regulatory things as well associated with their NSR rule. And so this project got caught up in that. Ultimately, EPA came out with a very prescriptive memo about how to do completeness for PSD permits. Very good. I mean, that's like, I think one of the greatest things that came out. And they came out with a couple of modeling memos. A lot of those, although not stated that it was Avenal related, you'll see in the footnotes how some of Avenal was incorporated in that and really affected how the NOx modeling part was looked at. Again, if anyone's interested in that, I can talk about that. And I'm not a modeler, but I worked very closely with a modeler on that. So there was a lawsuit. Ninth Circuit heard it, and the permit got remanded. And the project does not exist. Good history. I can send you. If you're interested, definitely, hit me up on the app or leave a card, and I can give you more detail. Okay, nonprofit. This is down in San Diego. I work and consult with an environmental justice group called Environmental Health Coalition. And I also still work for industry. So I do believe that there is a role for environmental professionals to do both areas. I list this here because part of what is unique is, in this case, environmental EHC, Environmental Health Coalition. They're located near the coast. So the concerns are port side, there's ship repair, actually mobile sources and the like. Same thing, put lots of paper there. In their case, they're able to affect a rule that was written. And I can tell you a little bit about my role with them. Let me pause and say, going back to this. So as a permit engineer involved directly in the mailing list, I've done a lot of the nitty gritty. I left before the permit was remanded. That was the voluntary leaving. Should be smiling, but yeah. Okay, and I did not get to hear the proceedings because in October of when they had the proceedings to talk to the Ninth Circuit, we were on furlough. So we weren't even allowed to as employees to listen to that because it was considered overtime or not allowed anyway. So for this particular organization, EHC, I'll tell you what my role has been and a little bit about what has been accomplished. I help them understand in shared common language what these rules mean that they're upset about. And there is a couple of things that have happened in this area, and I don't know if this would happen elsewhere in the country, but just to give you an idea. San Diego and many of the other California districts have these governing boards, and they typically kind of bless the regulations and the actions that the districts are doing. And it went from, I think, like 6 to 11 members. And there's a state legislation that explicitly allowed and said, we will have a board member that represents environmental justice. So that's one thing. And then they also expanded the board to provide a more diverse and flexible way of having boards that would be representative of the county's interests. EHC's interest has been community right to know from the get-go. So for 40 years, that's what they've been looking at. And their interest has been in public participation and notification, and specifically air toxics. I do want to put a note on this public participation and notification. And if you are interested, I mean, they actually let me sign a letter that was specific to public participation, because I do think that that is, you know, we're talking about business, government, and community. I think we all are interested in how does public participation happen? Because there are some concerns like, what if only 2 or 3 people show up to my meeting and we spent all this money, bought these cookies, brought in our lawyers? It's like, I don't know, maybe those are the 2 to 3 people that matter because either it's impacting them, they like your project, or they are an influencer and you don't know which side they're on. And unfortunately, I hate to talk about what side is, you know, is it one of the 3 sides or in the middle, but it's still an us versus them when people think about environmental justice. So I'm hoping part of this talk that I give today gives you a little bit of a different perspective. I want to talk about the air toxics rule, just to give you an idea. And when I get into the California related regulations, you'll kind of see this idea of interplay come in. This rule is not an environmental justice rule. It is a very specific toxic air contaminant rule. So when you go through news source review, what are your toxic impacts? What are the emissions? What's the health risk? Do I need to reduce my emissions because of a prescribed plan? Embedded in this rule has been notifying the public. Historically, it's been biennially to say, hey, there's a health risk. We're notifying you, public. There we go. Maybe people reply back. Maybe they don't. Maybe there's a hearing. Maybe there's not. Usually not a lot of activity. The rule came up for revision last year, and I was part of helping them understand what they could and could not say about the rule. So part of my interaction with them was like, no, that comment you want to make makes no sense whatsoever. And ultimately, what I was hoping to do was help them make meaningful comments that were aligned with what I understood was the intention of the rule. My role is not advocacy, so that's a very clear, distinct line. But my role is to make sure that if they're going to make a statement like, we don't like this, that they should be aware whether an agency has to respond to them or not. I think communities think that if they say something, the district or the agency is going to reply in whole. But if there's no jurisdictional requirement that compels them to do that, they're not obligated to. And in fact, I mean, there's a lot of reasons why somebody like Matt, you know, and lawyers will tell you that you've just got to kind of stay in that lane of whatever is in front of you. I'm going to fast forward and say a couple of things that came out of this was, let's see, the risk reduction plans that are coming out now, they're being public noticed. Communities have an opportunity to review them about how is somebody reducing their risks, and ultimately they can comment on it. And so just to give you an idea though, so EHC and me, we did not agree on a comment that they made, because my comment was, even if they come out with a plan and say this, it's tied to a permit. When it's tied to a permit, this is the action to be interested in. You can look at the plan, but if their plan involves this permit action, this is where you can get involved. You can do so by making comments here, but understand that you're most likely going to be able to have some effect here. And so now they're surprised. It's not a judgment, but they're surprised. There's so many public meetings happening on this. There's just, the calendars are getting filled up. There's public notices about health risk. There's public notices about risk reduction plans. And then they're going to get public notices about permit actions. And there's probably going to be stuff in between. And, you know, it's not like I told you so, but I think it's also educating the community to understand what can they really expect and what's meaningful for them. Does this matter for them? Let's see. And then my third experience is, if you've heard of California AB 617, it's a statewide program that identified areas disproportionately impacted, where monies have been given out. So these are the areas that are involved. And in those areas, the point is to monitor, measure, report emissions from the toxic air contaminants. And what ultimately comes out is what's called a community emission reduction plan. So this plan has a series of goals and objectives that is written by a community steering committee and goes forward and does what it needs to do by identifying whatever priorities they have. So the priorities are different parts of the state. And I want to bring this up because I think the state in these areas reflect other areas in the nation, potentially. So these plans that have been written up, they go from the local to the state approves them. There's a hearing for it, they take comments and the like. It's all on YouTube. And I think that there's some really good things. Some of the things that are listed are things already happening, fence line monitoring. But a lot of the items include things like those little personal monitors that folks have. What is it called? Purple Air is one of them, or these other backpacks. This is terrible that I'm not coming up with the name, but so it's equipping the local citizen with these walk around monitors. And let me say it differently. The plans aren't saying go out and do that, but it's like go out and monitor your air. And, you know, again, the program is intended to measure, report, monitor the impacts. Okay, so I have a client that got swept up in this. And so let me tell you the history. And really this sort of image of the gears, this is just representing the different areas of AB 617 areas. So my client sits in the Southern California area and is really a small player, a small part of what we'll call the ozone problem. The air agency wrote about how the amount of ozone in that area, 4% of it, is stationary sources. So not a big deal. And that really is about all this plant was, but it turns out this plant is also visually something that the community does not understand. And interestingly enough, and they were not aware of this until it showed up and they became aware in the draft, they were listed explicitly in the community emission reduction plan as a source to look into for its emissions, its compliance history. And it's not a big deal. It's not like it's hiding anything. It's also one of the few stationary sources amidst all of those that are listed here in these other regions that's actually listed. So it's a kind of somewhat interesting, unique situation. Now, while there aren't stationary sources listed in these other areas, and there are industry sectors, again, this one is called out by name. So what's happened is through this AB 617 process, these community organizations meet. It's both the air agency and the community organization. So I did not make that clear. AB 617 is a state mandate down to the local air agencies where the communities and the air agency work together. Again, this is the interplay and punch up to what ultimately is an approved plan. All right, so they got named, it got approved, the plan. And during the hearing where it got approved, there was an acknowledgement that, and this is ozone, so I know I mentioned that AB 617 typically talks about air toxics, kind of in the public setting, doesn't matter. You've already got this label now that you're in an area that has an air quality problem. But they're in an area where the problem is transport. To some of us that we all go like, okay, yeah, we get it. It probably isn't that plant. They had asked to be part of the steering committee because they said, oh, okay, well, if we're going to be listed, why don't let's ask, like formally ask, formally put it in the letter. Nobody said yes. Nobody said no. Nobody answered. I guess what's the term? Ghosted. They were ghosted. I guess so. They swipe left or swipe right. I don't know. And at the approval hearing by the state, there were public comments made that were dated about their compliance circumstances, that they had, in fact, had a violation of sorts. So if you go onto the ECHO database, you don't see that number. And so I think part of, well, let me not start to opine. So here we are listening. Oh, great, they have data. Oh, I don't know, we'll fix that. We'll let them know. So we requested also in the letter to say, hey, we'd like to be part of this report, hoping that before the report gets approved by the state, it's a simple little thing, add our letters to the column. That's not how we said it, but you know. And we didn't even get heard at that hearing. So we have had a series of requests to present at the steering committee, even during the draft portion of it. Had I not looked at my email, I would say we still haven't been invited to speak, but I learned this morning that we will be speaking later on in April, which is great. And I think what's also good about this is that there was a presentation by EPA to the same body of folks that described the permit, showed a really good infographic, you know, and ideally has already primed them for the public for understanding what's really happening at our plant. The last thing I want to say about this plant is that the hope is to also be able to do more outreach. And I think even though the fellow said to me, you know, they're kind of a case study, I just sort of a scratch of the surface, you know, AB 617 just sort of gets lumped into environmental justice. So there is a heightened awareness by them. Okay, what's our toxic emissions? They're pretty good. They're not, I mean, they're not exceeding the health risk thresholds. But it's also they're looking more closely at their operations. So what does that mean? Public participation. So there's a couple of things, and I'll try to go through this a little bit quickly. I call this the points of entry. These are common points of entry. Environmental reviews are like CEQA or NEPA, or even just building permits and the like. Public information requests, portals like WebFire, Echo Database, whatever the states and locals have on inventory. The rule plan development process, I don't think everybody thinks about this, but if there is a rule related to a device that you have, that's another entry point. So that in and of itself, you know, is something to keep in mind. And then in California, we have variances. I'm not sure how much other states have that. And then governing boards, these other opportunities where there are stated ways that the public can come in and comment. So then there's these passive ways like the WebFire, you know, portals. And I will say with Matt too, I scrubbed WebFire for other reasons, a really coal-fired project I was on. And we did go to RTP and go, what is up with your database? Because our clients submitted this information. It's not showing up. We've been written in a report over here. And he did say, yeah. So he told us about the, you know, the data exchange and how it works. And it's not necessarily hit or miss, but who is looking at it at the state or local setting is actually crucial. So I didn't realize until listening to Matt this morning that that's probably another area for WebFire, which is pretty passive information, right? You're already submitting it, but again, it could be an issue. So my comment here is essentially to consider that there is a place-based footprint that you have And that if you even have something like a compliance applicability matrix or the like, that there is a companion to this. So what me and my colleagues do is we put together a P2, if you will, entry points review. And I know it's lunchtime, so I'll be quick. If you have questions, let me know. But if you're wondering, like, is this a point of entry? It probably might be already. That's the whole thing. The next part is risk communications. If you've heard of Peter Sandman, risk equals hazard plus outreach. So this is a process that I like that you could do that running through 10 factors here, there's actually 12 factors to kind of think about what kind of outreach might be happening in your community. I know this is small, but again, email me, I'll have my slides and I can talk about this ad nauseum. I used this back in '94 and I have taken it along with me through all of the different projects I've had. It's been very, very helpful. And this is what I think on all sides, both community, government, and business, that the perspective of risk and outreach is quite different for folks. And also what really is a hazard, whether it's a significant threshold that's been listed, the community doesn't care sometimes. I mean, I think they do, and they can put it into perspective. But as Matt used a term, sometimes they might overreach, and they have the right to do so. This is from a public participation organization. And this is just to say, how do you communicate with the public? Do you inform, consult, involve, collaborate, or empower? All of those have very different tactics and different objectives when you're setting them up. And the members, the community likes to be in collaborate and empower ideally, but they also still want all this other information. And some of the inform can happen passively, again, through the information that you pull together, but kind of like what we do as businesses, you need to be pretty accurate and precise about the languaging that you're going to use. This whole is another role that my colleagues and I go through to kind of bring it together. And really, when we're talking about public participation, we're looking at this, sorry, a lot of Venn diagrams in real life, is where does corporate responsibility, and I mean, I think we can sort of put ESG into that, public participation and risk communications come together. So this is similarly kind of my thought about overlay business, government, and communities on top of that. Stephen Covey people, we know this sphere of influence, no different from you being an individual, what you can control, what you can influence, and what you can't. And again, this is very small, but there are things that you definitely can control. You cannot control other people's thoughts. You can influence them, right? So there's another middle circle that gives you ideas there. There's people's choices. And we can go back to this if folks have questions. I just want to kind of get back, keep going forward, is that when you're dealing with the people in community, I think we all think, focus on this group of people over here, the people who love you. You want to focus on the undecided as well. So I would say we would have, my other slide would have been the ellipse around the undecided and the people who love you. That is part of where you want to be, because honestly, probably people who don't love you don't really want to hear from you. And when some businesses are like, we're going to make sure we let them know what we're talking about. I mean, even if you're, as a regular citizen, you're like, yeah, I'm good. You can physically ghost them, right? You don't have to put it in mystery. Some of that was a lot to run through and don't have a lot of slides. I wanted to go through, this is going to be quick. But just to give you a flavor, and I promised my friends at P2 that I would put this together in a diagram. I did not have time before this conference, so I'll just start going through the list just so you can see and think about what I'm saying and this interplay. At the legislative level, AB 617 is one. SB 379 is a climate adaptation. That is just kind of an overlay over California. A lot of other states have that. SB 1000, land use general plans, safety and EJ. Now, city and county governments have building general plans and the like that are incorporating EJ explicitly. This started in 2018. AB 1001, specifically a way to take environmental justice and insert it into state permitting processes, straight up. That's where people hear about EJ screen. AB 1621 was an update to the environmental justice definition that added meaningful involvement as part of the definition. So this is why the public participation thing that I've mentioned is critical when people think about what am I going to do in an environmental justice related setting. And then more specific to folks here, in 2017, AB 1647 was for folks to have fence line monitoring and to have this information publicly available on the web. So people already in California are doing this. It is exactly what Matt was saying. They don't know how to interpret it, or they can see the numbers, but it's kind of, you know, I guess another pop culture term, a hot mess. And if a number is over a threshold, what does that mean? We know what it doesn't mean and what it does mean, but now the fact that businesses are doing real-time online reporting and fence line monitoring isn't going away, and that was something, you know, Matt also mentioned. I think how it's playing out in California already is probably a good kind of, you know, weather vane, kind of little yellow, orange flags. Another thing that's separate, I mentioned about environmental reviews. There was an environmental review called Friant Ranch. Long story short, now in just the environmental reviews like NEPA, CEQA, health impact, air quality health impacts need to be identified. They did not before. There are modeling guidelines to this now, which is really intense, I would say, because it's regional. And there are some agencies, Sacramento agency has a modeling, has guidelines for this. And just on a different side note, you would be surprised, South Coast AQMD is saying, yeah, we like those guidelines, but they're for facilities in your district, not in ours. So I think they've drawn an interesting line, I think, because if I could imagine that if South Coast wanted to pick this up and drop it into theirs, I mean, I think a lot of other agencies might start following that. This is recorded, so I don't know how this is going to play out later, if this is going to age poorly. But, you know, I think this is something really new because these environmental reviews are not prescriptive to enforcement or compliance, but now you'll start seeing this seep over into the permitting side of things. And it is, and here's how. In the Bay Area, they are implementing SB 1000 that I mentioned, and they are looking at their general plans, and Bay Area has hired people who have city planning background. That is a good chunk of folks. They have had programs for reducing health impacts in vulnerable populations since 2014, preceding a lot of the environmental justice related discussions. But more importantly, the air district and the land use is coming together in the air agency through permitting. So they have revised and updated their NSR and major source permitting rule. And they are even looking at greenhouse gas, land use conflicts, and that they're pushing out there also education and outreach. That is also part of those requirements. I would not be surprised if some of this starts to seep into other districts in California and elsewhere. And lastly, San Diego. So I talked about what they're doing, what I was doing for EHC, but in general, San Diego's been doing two other things. They have what's called a public participation plan. So they have actually outlined a plan for how they are pushing information out in communities and specifically environmental justice areas overlaying AB 617. And on top of that, the state has an Office of Environmental Justice, and they are in the process of getting their resources shored up to work on that. So that's what those symbols are on the right side. I have probably, I don't know, exceeded my time limit. And I was curious, you still stayed here. One person left. That's okay. I won't take it. What is it? I got 4 minutes. I'm not going to take it all out. You all can take up the 4 minutes for me because I'm curious, you know, what you thought about some of the information I presented. I went over it quite fast, but I could dig into a lot of them very deeply, very quickly.
I think the one question that we want, or really